Hello, everyone out there watching. My name is Dr. Gina Rosich. I'm here with Dr. Christine Caruso and Dr. Steve Ross, and we are members of the UBI Taskforce. And we are here to get public input on this project proposal for City Council. We have a PowerPoint. Steve, do you want to bring it up? Okay. So just to begin, we were commissioned to put together a proposal for the City Council for what's known as a Universal Basic Income Project. And we, as part of this project, we value as a team having the input and insight of members of the community on the basis of, research about us without us. This is coming from the city of Hartford. So therefore, the folks of the city of Hartford should be instrumental in voicing their ideas and concerns. And so that is exactly why we are here today. You can move to the next slide. Great. And just as a little bit of background for anyone out there, the UBI Task Force was developed to, it was put together in order to develop recommendations. And one of the things we were tasked with doing as the mandate is to develop this program specifically for single working caregivers of children. So it was single working parents. And we are using the term caregivers, primary caregivers of children, so that it's not assumed what the family structure is. You could have a single mom, you could have a single dad, you could have a grandparent raising a grandchild, any constellation where there is a single individual who is the primary caregiver responsible for one or more children. And we are looking to create a sustainability plan. We're also going to look for potential funding, and a report will be issued to the Court of Common Council, and we can't submit that report. We don't want to submit that report without your feedback.
I'm
going to hand it over to Steve Ross.
And so, as you'll see, this is just a list of the members. It is a mix of academics like myself and Gina, Amanda, who will join us later, as well as a number of community members who are involved with nonprofit organizations or public service organizations where they have a real tie to the Hartford community. And as Gina mentioned, our task is really to not necessarily decide what this looks like as much as it is to make recommendations to the City Council. And much of this presentation is really just going to say, these are options we're putting on the table. These are the recommendations we're considering and trying to get feedback. And so if I turn to the first slide, for example, wish I could see all of the first slide, but Zoom is not always as easy as we would like. There. So the goal is for us is to, if a UBI were implemented, part of the process would not just be to implement a universal basic income, but it would be sort of to document a series of decisions and outcomes people were making who are receiving this universal basic income transfer, which would be an unconditional check that they would receive every 2 weeks, for example. And then the study would try to document the spending choices they made, how receiving the universal basic income might have changed their use of time, for example, with relation to time spent with children, the impact of this on healthcare, employment, educational pursuit, impacts on caregiver-child relationships, looking at children's educational outcomes, understanding how the well-being and health of the recipients have changed, possibly in response to receiving the universal basic income transfer, which could include effects on caregivers and children, might also include biological measures of stress, and also examining the economic stability of these families that are receiving the UBI. So these are some of the sort of goals that we developed in terms of the information we thought it would be important to collect over time during this pilot study when some families would be receiving UBI. And so we're now sort of want to open it up. Do people have thoughts about these choices, possibly priorities among these choices, where we should put resources to collect data, as well as other things they feel that we're missing that we really need to look at in terms of understanding the impact of the UBI program. So if anyone wants to put information in the chat where we could allow them to then, if you entered into the chat that you wanted to talk, we could give you access to talk through your microphone. Or if you were to raise your hand, for example, we could give you access to talk through your microphone, where I won't see your picture, so you can't physically raise your hand. But usually if you look, you'll have this hand raise ability along the top of your screen as part of your Zoom connection. But if you're having trouble figuring that out, just click on the chat and type in, and then hit send, and simply say you'd like to ask a question. Okay, so I guess we'll move on to the next topic we want to put on the table. As we said, we've just talked about some of the critical questions and data collection efforts that might take place during and after the implementation of a universal basic income. And the next question has to do with the very nature of the study. And there are really two possible ways to proceed. And right now, the city of Hartford has authorized funds to provide a universal basic income transfer to 25 families. The idea is that these families would be randomly selected from eligible families so that anyone who was eligible and made the effort to apply would have an equal chance to receive this as any other family who had also made the effort to apply. And there are, as I said, two possible ways to go forward. One would be to track those 25 families who are randomly selected to receive the universal basic income, this monthly or bi-monthly check, and then also randomly select 25 additional families who applied, who are applicants, and invite them to be members of a control group. The control group individuals would not receive the universal basic income transfer, but they would receive compensation for their time. So we know that participating in the study, filling out questionnaires, and other activities that might be involved in participating in the study takes time, and these individuals will be compensated for their time, but would not be receiving the monthly check. Now, the other alternative is to have an observational study of just 25 families receiving universal basic income transfer, but not following anyone else. And you can really sort of think about these studies as having two different goals. If we think about the observational study where we just follow the UBI individuals, this ends up being a proof of concept, right? That the city of Hartford has sort of proved that they can manage this, implement it, track families. The success of this activity could possibly be used to raise funds to implement this more broadly. And essentially, it's a proof of concept. But it's going to be very difficult in that observational study to actually say much about the impact of the universal basic income. And that's especially true because many of the families in Hartford over the next couple of years are going to be economically recovering from the pandemic. And so following them over time, it will be hard to know whether we're sort of observing the effect of the UBI or watching people simply recover from the economic shocks that were created by the pandemic. So the randomized control trial will address that second concern. It's a bigger endeavor, it's a larger commitment of resources. It might mean that for the same number of families being helped, it's going to cost more money, or for the same amount of money, less families would actually receive the UBI. But what this would allow us to do is to follow families who received the UBI and families that did not receive the UBI and compare them. And then any effects of recovering from the pandemic or other things that might be happening over time could be observed within the control group, and those could be then differenced out so we could see the impact of the UBI, the universal basic income, by looking at those families who receive the transfer and then comparing them to this control group. And so we wanted to stop for a second and get reactions to these two possible ways of going forward. And so I'm again going to stop talking and open up the chat and look for anyone who would like to raise their hand or would like to note in the chat that they'd like to talk. So I see that Yesenia Kandi has a question, and I'm going to now just take a second and allow Yesenia to unmute so she can ask her question. And if she can't, then, so I've clicked ask to unmute. So Yesenia, if you wish to talk, you'd have to unmute and then I can allow you to talk. And if I...
Hello.
Hi, Yesenia, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, how are you? So, seeing the two options, I really think the first one would be best. But my question is, what criteria are we going to be monitoring in the 25 families that are receiving the UBI? Is it like, what do they spend on it? Are they saving it? So what exactly are we looking at? A family that gets the UBI and then a family that does not? Like, what kind of information are we looking for exactly?
Well, so we wouldn't necessarily ask them exactly what they spend the UBI on. I guess we can ask them that. But what we might more broadly look at is how are they spending their family income and see how that might change over time as they start receiving the UBI. So at the very beginning, for example, we might say, how much free time do they have to spend with their kids? Ask them information about food insecurity, rent burdens. And of course, so under item 1, we could imagine both for the control group and for the treatment group, we might be asking sort of, how are you spending your time that you have available during the day, and how are you spending the financial resources you have to feed your family, to maintain your housing, etc. And then, of course, over maybe quarterly, sort of once every 3 months, we would come back and ask similar questions again of both the control group and the group receiving the universal basic income transfer. In addition to spending questions, of course, we would likely have questions about employment, questions about access to healthcare, questions about the family relationship, which could be their perceived quality of the relationship, any stress or emotional issues. Perhaps there's been a reduction in stress or that improvement of the relationship between the caregiver and their children. We also would try over the year to get some information on children's educational outcomes, both for the UBI group and if there was a random control trial for the treatment group. And then if we have information on income, we can, of course, look sort of how stable is their income and has their income become more stable as they've begun to receive the UBI by comparing them, either looking at them overall or comparing them to the control group. Yesenia, did that sort of answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to chime in that we have a couple of slides that offer a little more details about your questions. And Thomas says he still is seeing the first slide. Is that true for other folks? Are you only seeing the first slide?
No, that's because I moved back to answer Yesenia's question. Oh, wait, he's only seeing this side that says City of Hartford basic income.
Yeah, that's what he just typed into the chat. So I'm wondering, are other folks seeing different slides or still only the first one? Okay, somebody else said that they're, oh, now he said he's seeing goals. Okay, thank you.
So now let's move down. We were just finished this discussion about the random control trial versus more of the observational proof of concept study. And so now we're going to move forward and talk about how it would work in terms of who's eligible. As I noticed already, who could receive the UBI and why? And as I said, or as Gina said, we have certain mandates from the City of Hartford. And one of the key mandates from the City of Hartford was we'd be looking at single parent families with children. And I think to a large extent, the reason behind that, of course, is with only one adult to care for a family, this family is likely to be, on average, more resource scarce, either in terms of time or income. We have then made some additional modifications or some to follow this, we've tried to add some details to it. So, for example, we've looked at the idea of sort of eligibility being a single working primary caregiver who may have one or more children, but at least one of these children is between 3rd and 8th grade, with the goal of looking at children between 3rd and 8th grade so that we could have information from standardized testing within the State Department of Education. So if we see someone in 3rd grade, we can see their standardized test that they will take in the spring. And then a year later, after they had been receiving the UBI for a year, we'd be able to see their child taking the test a year later, which could give us a good sense of what type of impact the universal basic income might be having on these standardized test scores that the state administers every year. We also could potentially get information on grades or report cards or other possible academic outcomes that would allow us to look at the other children who are not just within 3rd through 8th grade. We do not have any income requirement. Anyone who meets the requirements above would be eligible, except for the requirement of at least part-time work, which was again part of the requirement that was put in place by the City Council when they assigned us to make recommendations. And finally, people are going to have to sort of volunteer, right? And so the idea was we would have a lot of recruitment going on, community outreach, possibly through churches, through nonprofits, mailings, information on the city webpage, a variety of ways to get the news out there. And then individuals would have to go online, perhaps to a website that's run by the City of Hartford, hopefully creating a bit of trust, right? You know, the mailings come from the City of Hartford. It's the City of Hartford website. It seems real. If they're worried, there's someone they can call at the city who will say, yes, this is real. And so that is sort of the general idea. And then individuals, to be eligible, they're going to have to go online and fill out a short, non-invasive survey about them and their family that will allow us to sort of confirm their eligibility. Then once we get a sample of volunteers over a period of time, then there would be a random sample drawn that would allow us to draw a UBI sample, giving everyone an equal chance, as well as possibly a controlled sample. And again, I'm going to stop now, and anyone who wants to talk, we can allow them to talk and ask questions. As I said, I'll watch for a hand being raised, or I'll look in the chat.
We have a hand raised by Tanea Taylor, and I have opened the mic for her.
Thank you. Hi. I just wanted to comment about the gauging results from standardized testing. I think it's been studied that standardized testing is not a good way to gauge results for success and progress. So I do encourage the other ways that you named to be maybe a standard in that.
I agree that there are many different approaches to address. I think standardized testing does capture basic academic literacy that is important and certainly has been shown to affect individual success. But also there are a lot of non-cognitive social measures that have been shown to also predict success that we would not want to ignore. And to the extent that we can, for example, work with the school district of Hartford to provide information on report cards, to provide information on attendance, and we can examine these other types of measures that will capture some of these other issues that I absolutely agree are important. I think we will certainly do that. It's just going to be a process of getting that data from the school district and whether the school district is willing to share it. And we're certainly not restricting ourselves to just looking at standardized test scores, because you're right, there are many different ways to measure achievement, all of which positively can explain outcomes for different reasons.
I'm also, if I can just chime in also, that the qualitative research piece of this is really going to involve talking with folks about their lived experiences. And so, moving beyond standardized measures, which can be used for comparison, we'll be able to talk to people and really get insight into how the folks receiving the benefits, how they perceive their life as changing, and how their kids are doing as a result.
Danaya, do you have any follow-up question? Okay. So going on.
Oh, oops. I thought I was unmuted. Sorry.
Oh, you go ahead.
Sorry, I was talking. So no, I was just worried that if we were looking at data like the standardized test scores and, it would show that maybe some scores stayed the same, that they would say it was unsuccessful when there are other factors where there were successes in with the child aside from academics.
So, I guess, to be a little more responsive than just to say the things we're going to do anyway, there are other things that we could consider doing that we haven't really talked about that could be covered in part of this sort of interview aspect that Gina described. So Gina's sort of describing a qualitative aspect of this research where we have, since we only have 25 or 50 families, interviews can take place with these families. We can gather qualitative research about their experiences. But there are also short inventories out there that capture things like non-cognitive social skills, which we know have also been shown to sort of predict success in life. And so something we could do is we could incorporate one of these sort of social skills, non-cognitive skills inventories, maybe a short one that wouldn't take too much time, into the interviews that Gina's talking about conducting. And so that's something, I just want to mention that something we could sort of put on the table that we have not talked about.
And we do have other scales that include things like the family chaos scale, I think it's called, because, sometimes, one of the things that we want to look at is overall, how is the family doing, and success as a family can mean many things. And one of them has to do with the stress that the children are feeling and the stress that that everybody in the family is feeling, and whether some of those stresses go down as a result of this, to me, would be a huge success, right? Because money is is probably the biggest stressor in people's lives, right? And so that's why we want to look at how that changes when this funding is provided.
I see that an anonymous attendee wrote in a question. I don't know if they're in the participant lists and whether they, so I will just read this question. It says, a lot of parents are so overwhelmed with work and scheduling conflicts, and I feel this program can allow parents to ease their schedules, spend more time at home with their children, and focus on reading to their children, spending quality time that will explore the social and emotional state of each child, ultimately impacting the standardized testing in a positive way. And I think I agree with that. I do think that we'll have a number of ways to pick that up. Certainly that we may see impacts on the standardized testing, or if not on the testing, on the grades, or even on just simply on attendance, which we know really matters. And we may also see it in terms of some of these other measures about family stress, as Gina said, family chaos, or spending time, right? So we are talking about inventory parents or caregivers on how much time they're spending with their children. To the extent that this eases their schedule or they're able to spend more time with their kids, we certainly will document that.
And then just to reiterate that use of time is one of the things that we're asking people about, right? And that relates exactly to what you're talking about.
And so Tanaya had a third question. I'm just going to ask it to save a little bit of time. Who would be doing the interviews and processing the data? And I can't say who would be doing the interviews. Gina, do you have you had discussions about sort of the manpower to make interviews happen, or?
No, so I mean, we would have to put together an IRB proposal and see who is trained to do this kind of work would be able to do that. Myself, I would certainly be one of the people who would be doing some of these interviews. We, as a team of researchers, would process, analyze the data, but in terms of doing the interviews, that's part of the whole process of figuring some of this out, because maybe we would include somebody who is not a researcher, but who is people feel comfortable with in the community, who is also, for example, there to provide, I don't know, benefits counseling information, for example. And so that is one of the things that's still a little up in the air. And I actually wonder if you have any thoughts on who do you think that people would trust to work with?
So, and I'd ask people to either raise their hand so we can unmute you, or ask us in the chat to do that.
I would say there's like some facilitators and healers and artists in the community who would definitely fit that role, that have research in the social services.
Yes, I think there's been discussion about having, and Gina mentioned benefits counseling, because of course, when you receive the next additional transfer, it can impact your other benefits you're receiving. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the city council or the city government reaching out to some of the local community organizations to be partners that would then, once the individuals who are part of this are identified, they could get some benefits counseling within with some of these local nonprofits who would facilitate this. And I certainly could imagine that those organizations could play a role in doing the interviews. Christine, you come from that background, so maybe you should jump in a bit.
Yes, absolutely. So organizations such as ours, Hispanic Health Council, but many community-based organizations have partnered in research and have a variety of staff who are frontline and who have interacted with folks in a variety of capacities, including in doing things like interviews or collecting survey data and things like that. So I think that there are many potential community partners, but I really appreciate your suggestion, Tanaya. And if there are specific folks or organizations you think that we should be aware of, we're going to provide our contact information to both the City Council President's Office, as well as our own contact information. Please feel free to put us in touch with these folks or reach out to us and let us know who we should check out. And we would be very happy to follow up on that as well. So thank you.
Okay, so moving on. So the next important slide is that some people will not be eligible for the universal basic income, at least some of our suggestions. As I said, we had suggested restricting ourselves to this 3rd to 8th grade range, where if you're not a legal custodian of at least one child in this grade range, then you would not be eligible for the sample. But of course, that's a decision we could revisit. It's not a mandate from the City Council. It's just part of having, for this very small sample, some key information that we believe is important. Another issue would be if someone receives supplemental security income, because this is a federal program over which states have very little control, and receiving the universal basic income could have a substantial impact on your receipt of these disability payments. Similarly, receiving universal basic income, if you are receiving child support or paying child support, could create legal issues with court-ordered payments, and therefore we have thought it was wise to avoid jumping into that morass. We are also restricting it to individuals who are either a U.S. citizen, or we're recommending this for simplicity, either a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident with a green card. And of course, they would have to be a resident of the city of Hartford. And as I said, most of these are set up either because of the legal complexities of receiving an additional transfer. For example, imagine you get this transfer for a year, and then you're forced to go back to court to undo changes in child support that occurred because you were receiving this transfer. That would be a very difficult burden on an individual. And so we want to avoid putting individuals in those types of situations. Again, we're open to other situations where there could be issues or problems. So I'm going to again pause and take a look at the chat and open up the participant list for any comments that people might have. So in terms of the disbursement of the funds, we were talking about a debit card being issued once a month for $500. And these debit cards would not expire at the end of the month. They would have a substantially forward expiration date. So if individuals wanted to save the money because they wanted to give themselves a buffer or because they knew they had a significant expense coming up, that should be fine. I think usually you can have these debit cards set up so they'll run for at least a year. As we mentioned before, if you are selected as a UBI recipient, you would receive this $500 per month card. Moreover, if the UBI recipients would also receive some modest compensation for the time they spend filling out surveys and participating in interviews, which would be the same level of compensation that will be received by the control group if we end up having a control group, compensating people there for their time, just to make sure they are filling everything out on time and submitting it, and then compensating them for their diligent work. Again, I'll pause again, although this is a pretty short slide. People may have some thoughts about how this should take place. And I should note, probably people, in terms of the compensation for time spent associated with filling out surveys and other things, this is something that's probably going to be happening essentially quarterly, maybe 4 times a year. There'll be something going on, some type of survey being taken or some type of draw of data. So when people were initially selected, they would spend some time involved in having data collected. That would be, they would be reimbursed for that time. 3 months later, there would be additional information collected and they'd be reimbursed for that time. And that could go on at least till the end of the year and possibly some months after the program had ended. Because the money, the program is really set up to only run for 1 year, because that's what the funds are available for. This has to do with what we're going to basically ask. And I guess I sort of jumped ahead a bit and I wasn't careful. But what are the key things we were going to be asking the individuals in the UBI is information about their financial well-being. Again, we've talked about the idea of how they're allocating their monthly income. And so we can see how that allocation might change when the UBI comes in. It's not mentioned here, but I think we're also going to collect information on how they allocate their time in terms of where they spend their time. That was certainly listed as one of the goals. So there's going to be some type of short aspect of a survey where we're asking people to tell us how they spend their resources. And so some of those resources could be financial, but also some of those resources could also be their time resources. Because of course, one way to spend income coming in is to spend more time with your kids and less time at work. We want to capture that. There'll also be some items to pick up the emotional and well-being of both the caregivers and the children. Again, we're looking at surveys every 3 months. There may be biological measures of stress. I should note these are very non-invasive. Essentially, this includes a little snip off of your hair and putting the hair that you cut off into an envelope and mailing it back. So it's relatively non-invasive. The final thing that I don't see on the slides right now, but I want to mention, is that we would also ask people to give permission for us to access more administrative data. Specifically, of course, we would not want to access any data from Hartford Public Schools to analyze how their kids are doing in school without the consent of the parents, both in the treatment group and the control group if we collect one. And so, as I said, people are being asked to participate within these a survey that's going to cover, or interview that's going to cover many of these issues, as well as sort of give permission for access to some key administrative data sets. And I see Amanda is now here. And what I'm going to do you want to bring your version of the slides up and have me unshare these? Or
actually, I think it's fine if you don't mind just advancing.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
I just wanted to interject. It looks like there's a question in the Q&A from the slide previous to this. So I wonder if we want to just
thanks,
address
Christine.
that before we move forward, just, so we're kind of
Yes.
staying with folks.
Yeah.
Here we are.
The question is, how fast is the turnaround once selected into the program to receiving the first payment?
And I don't believe that's decided. That is going to probably depend to some extent on how things are organized. I think probably we're going to want to collect that first round of data, and that may take, I don't know how long that will take, but one could imagine you would have this first round of data you would collect, and then after collecting that data, it should be it shouldn't take very long to get money issued after that, unless there's some type of bottleneck at the city hall, which we don't really know very well. But I don't see anything, any major obstacle to sending the payments out relatively soon after completing the baseline survey. And so the only question is how long to sort of mail it, have people complete this baseline survey. If that would take a couple of weeks, then checks could go out sometime soon after that. Is that a fair statement, people?
Yeah, I thank you for that. I also want to add that in other studies, like the Stockton study, there was, they described this as an onboarding process. So folks would complete the consent forms. There would be an explanation of how the program was going to work and what we were asking of people, so that you fully understand what it is that we're asking of you, and then setting up the system so that people can get their card, and have a login, and how to access surveys, or things like that. Getting people's basic information, as you said, they all call that as an onboarding process. And so I imagine that the onboarding process, once that's completed, then we would be eager to get the first payment out quickly, to get people, to get the ball rolling, right? Because the sooner that starts, the sooner people can start getting some financial relief, and then we can really see what's happening with folks. So there's no intention to kind of like string people along or hold off payments for 6 months or anything like that. But beyond that, an exact date or time frame, it's just not possible for us to give something really precise right now.
Amanda, you're up.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Detmer. I am one of the task force members, and happy to be here with you all. So what I'm going to be doing now is going into a little more detail on each of the kinds of things that we would be recommending to the City Council, that we would be asking of participants. And we would be really thrilled to hear your feedback and input on each of these as we go along. So this is really the previous slide, which Steve finished on, but in expanded form. Okay, so first on the list was to show the efficacy of this program, we would be really keen to collect data and information on the financial well-being of families that receive UBI. For this, we would ask for information from adults only. For items A through C would be monthly, once a month. So that would be submitting a report on your household needs and budget, a report on how you spend your UBI funds, and a report on your decision-making for use of funds. So like what kinds of factors led you to decide to spend money on whatever it is you spent your money on. So those we would recommend would be monthly. The other measures would be only once every 3 months for the duration of the program. So that's D through G, and that would be total monthly income, savings, and debt, report on your changes of employment. And so this might be maybe you're working more hours or fewer hours, or you had a change in job status, etc. F would be report on your efforts to change jobs. So maybe in the last 3 months you actively began job searching, or you enrolled in school or vocational programs or something like that. And most of these would be conducted, if not all, via online surveys or via in-person interviews over the phone. So this is item 1 for financial well-being. And again, we would only ask for adults because there are other measures we would be interested on child outcomes as well to show the efficacy of the program. So I'm curious what others think, what everyone thinks of supplying this information. And I'm trying to check the Q&A. I know it's a lot to digest, so I don't know if we want to give it a moment. But also folks can type questions in to the Q&A and we can answer as we go. And for my fellow panelists, please definitely jump in if I've missed anything or if you have anything else to add. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so what else are we recommending that participants be asked to provide? Second measure, and this is really important to help show the ways in which UBI could be effective. And so we are recommending that, similar to other programs that have implemented UBI, that participants would provide information on both their emotional well-being and their physical well-being. And so this would be both for the caregivers and the children. And this kind of information we would only ask for once every 3 months. And so here's some of the measures that we would be recommending. The first, under item A, are standard surveys, again, that you would conduct online or over the phone. And these standard surveys would have you report on your and your child's psychological distress or psychological well-being, your physical functioning, as well as your perceived stress. So how stressful do you feel like things are over the last 3 months with work, with school, interactions with others, etc. We'd ask for you to report on your household food insecurity and your food inventory, and then your sleep quality, because this is a really important measure of health. For item B, we'd be asking, instead of like a standard survey, we'd be asking open-ended questions. So we would ask you a question and you just provide an open-ended answer, talk for as long as you want on things like number of medical visits, ability to take medications, but not importantly, we won't be asking about specific medications like what you're taking, just ability to acquire those. And then things like types of social support that you have, what are your strains on your time and your self-care, ability to enjoy recreational or activities for fun, and things like that. So again, these are some of the items that we'd be recommending would be asked once every 3 months for both caregivers and children. Do we have any other questions in the box or any submitted on, is anyone monitoring the Facebook as well?
I don't know if anyone is monitoring to the Facebook. We do have another Q&A that says,
Okay.
I like the idea that we will give the option to complete the survey online or over the phone, seeing as some people are not too familiar with using a computer.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that point up. And this is exactly the kind of feedback that we had wanted. You know, we're definitely aware that some people may not have familiarity with computer use or just not prefer it. They just might not prefer to answer questions like that on a computer. They might just prefer to have it done over the phone. And so this is really great input. Thank you for that. And I think my understanding is we would recommend that both options would be available rather than just one or the other. But other panelists, do you have more to add to that? No? Okay. All right. Okay, a third type of measure that we would recommend to the City Council be asked of participants, again, this is once every 3 months, would be information on, instead of emotional and physical well-being, kind of other types of outcomes for both caregivers, children, and the family. And so you can see them listed here. I'll go through them one by one. So we would ask the caregivers to provide information on children's report cards and school attendance, also things like detentions and suspensions. Were there any changes in the last 3 months in your child's after-school program activities? Importantly, we're interested in tracking interactions between caregivers and their children and what those are like, as opposed to the previous 3 months. We would provide questionnaires on what the home environment is like. And then again, some other open-ended questions. These are like free answer types of things about how it feels to receive funds in an unconditional way. And then we'd ask for other reflections on just how you feel about being involved in this study. And again, our goal would be to provide these either online, on a computer, or over the phone.
Speaking of over the phone, I just wanted to point out, if anybody is watching this on television, that if you have a question, you can also call in, and the phone number is 646-558-8656. Again, that's 646-558-8656. and it's webinar ID 849-9455-3500. Again, webinar ID 849-9455-3500. And we have a Q&A question. If a person does not fill out the survey on a timely fashion, or you can no longer get in contact with them, will they be disqualified for the next month payment? And if so, will you recruit a new family to take over the spot?
This is a great question. Task force members who are present, I know this is frustrating in part because we don't exactly have answers, and all we can say is what we would recommend to the city council might happen. So is there anyone on the task force who would like to address this?
We had a specific recommendation.
Yeah, I believe we had discussed not taking over a new spot. Is that correct?
Well, the decision was that we would if it happened quickly, if I remember correctly, right? It was that if
Thank you.
I believe it was
like
Gina's
a couple months at the
proposal.
start.
Yeah.
Is if it happened quickly within a month or two, we would add someone very quickly from the pool of eligible drawn randomly. But if it happened well into the study, then we would just view them as attrited.
Okay. Right. So within go ahead.
Yeah, and then also, people may choose not to answer one or more of the questionnaires or interview questions within the study itself at any time, because it's all informed consent.
That's right. Thank you for making that point, Gina. So I just want to reiterate Steve's point that within a couple of months of the start of the UBI program, we would not replace someone who kind of went missing or we couldn't keep track of. But for people who don't want to answer any of the questions, that is well within their right. I think this might be getting a little bit, it sounds to me like this is a little bit of a different question, like they don't fill out the survey in a timely fashion.
It's something, I think there's the distinction of if we're really losing touch with someone versus if we don't hear back, in a timely manner. And I think that we can recognize that we can be very flexible around the latitude and realizing that some people may have a lot of difficulties in responding quickly and flexible about that. It's more of a question of being completely out of touch. If we're not able to be in touch with someone and we can no longer confirm that their residence or desire to participate, I think that there would be some distinction, and we need to figure out, sort of ways to be able to assess that on a case-by-case basis. For instance, we did acknowledge that if people were living in Hartford and moved out of Hartford, that would also change the conditions of participation as well, as another example. So there are a few of those issues, but I think as everyone has mentioned, people can decline to answer or participate in any part of the assessments components, and that would not disqualify them. But I think it's a different issue if we lose touch with them altogether.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Christine. You said that much more clearly than I was trying to, so I appreciate that. Absolutely. Yeah. I just reiterate what Christine said. And I really want to drive home the point again that was on a couple slides ago, where all of these measures would be required to be consensual. So you would only be providing information if you wanted to. And if there were particular questions or surveys that were given to your children as well, they also would only do those if they provided consent. So, and you can always opt out. You can say, no, I don't want to answer that, or I don't want to provide that information or that sample or what have you. So I hope that clarified the question. There's another question. Is the UBI project for people who do not have children? Great question. So the task force or the city council put together this task force, and I think the resolution at the beginning, can't remember if we went over it in the first slides, but this initial pilot program, and which is a pilot program only, would be for single caregivers of children. but caregiver may be broadly defined, and we are actually recommending that caregiver is not necessarily a biological parent. It could be it should be considered someone who has custodial guardianship of a child.
Yes, we did go over that, actually, but
Okay.
yeah, and because it was one of the very few mandates from the city, all participants would have to have custody, primary custody of at least one child.
Mm-hmm. Right. But the idea is that this pilot program then would, prove to be beneficial enough that hopefully it could be expanded to folks without children at some point. Okay, before we move on to sort of the fourth category of items that we would recommend.
Amanda,
yeah.
Am I the only one hearing noise outside?
I don't know.
Talking in the background? It just disappeared.
Oh.
Okay, never mind.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so are there any other questions before? Sorry. Sorry about that. I think it's the location I am in. It's the best that I can do for my circumstances, so there's a little bit of background noise. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so the last type of information we would recommend be requested of participants in the program would be biological measures, and there's a really good rationale, good reason for collecting some biological measures. So it's really important to study how UBI might affect health, psychological health, emotional health, and physical health. And it's really important to show to gather data that might improve chances of UBI becoming more widely implemented, right? If we can show that it affects health at the individual level and also at the population level. And so one way to do this is to study how UBI affects stress, because stress impacts all manner of health outcomes. And so these would include biological measures of stress. So we're really interested to know what the community feels about the possibility of providing some biological measures once every 3 months. And we would be asking or recommending that these be collected for both caregivers and children. And so one option would be to provide very small, tiny hair samples about the width of a pencil. Or alternatively, if folks are not comfortable providing hair samples, could be fingernail clippings. And this would be to measure stress hormones. And then the other type of biological measure would be either saliva sample or a cheek swab, and that's depicted in the bottom picture there, where you just like rub a Q-tip on your cheek. And so this is to measure other types of indicators of stress that you can't get in your hair or your fingernails. And so in our committee meetings, we've talked about the possibility that these could be collected by researchers who are trained to collect these samples at neighborhood sites, or we could provide information for how you could collect them at home and mail them in. So we're really keen to get some feedback on what folks think about this.
It's Tanea. Hi. It just I feel like there's a lot of hoops that residents are going to be having to jump through, and I think
Mm-hmm.
I understand like the need to collect data, but it also seems like there just needs to be some sort of, I don't want to say barrier that residents have to go through. So I hear that you're saying they're recommended and suggested, so I hope that they really are.
So I'm hearing you say that it's kind of feeling like a whole lot of asks of the participants. Is that right, Tanea?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is exactly the kind of feedback that we want. I really appreciate your honesty and your candor. And so I guess another follow-up question would be, are there certain items that you are more acceptable, that would be more acceptable to you and to others to collect, and some that you would want to see gotten rid of?
I think the biological measures seem like a bit much, but I'm also curious about the ways in which stress is measured, because that's something that in our other health equity groups we've been talking about being like a factor of health. So I'm curious about that data, if we can get this slideshow after.
Oh, yeah. So to follow up a little more, are you wondering how we get the biological measures of stress with these samples, or just kind of in general across the whole study, how we measure stress?
Like just that you named about how, you know, stress is just a factor of health, and like, you know, we want to see how it's doing. Like, where did that, like, I want to say like mental health component come in even?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think back on, Steve, could you go back to either one or two slides back? Thank you. Yeah, so here, the idea is that we would measure both mental health and kind of biological health, and and physical health. So kind of looking at really multiple dimensions of health and underlying stress as a contributor to health outcomes, right? And so the psychological or mental health would be in the surveys of, say, perceived stress, and standardized surveys on psychological distress. And the idea then is that we would be able to link that with potentially with the biological measures that we get to show, one, that yes, as we predict, or as the science seems to show, that the biological stress is influencing these outcomes. And then two, is UBI kind of changing these outcomes? Is it reducing biological stress levels and therefore also reducing psychological distress, as just one example? I hope that that's a little clearer.
And I actually pulled up a list, if you're interested in some of those measures. There's something called a sleep quality scale and a perceived stress scale. And then there's other scales that ask questions about people's psychological distress, or questions about household, you know, the confusion hubbub and order scale. And so these are all validated instruments that measure stress in different ways, in addition to the open-ended questions that we would ask people about their perceived sense of stress and how that might change. So this is like a really exciting question for you to ask.
Another way to get this in some ways, that we could hear from Yelena again, Sarah, is if there was, so the idea is that both the treatment and the control group participants will be compensated for their time. So let's say the survey on average, the entire battery of surveys on average takes, let's say, 40 minutes to participate. Would a $30 gift card for 40 minutes of your time, is that sort of a reasonable amount of compensation? You know, because that's probably ends up being about $40 an hour. Is that a reasonable amount of compensation for sort of filling out this type of survey and taking that time, or not? Or even with the compensation, is 40 minutes just going to be too long? And you think the survey needs to be shorter, or the compensation needs to be higher? I mean, this ends up being an important question about feasibility, right? In terms of if we have compensation for filling out the survey and the survey takes X amount of time, is it reasonable to expect people to do it?
Yeah, great point, Steve. Thank you. And also given the fact that some surveys would be monthly, others would be once every 3 months. So that's a really great question. And these are exactly the kinds of questions that we really want your feedback on, so that we can provide the best recommendations in our report to the City Council.
We have another question in the Q&A, which says, will clients stay anonymous from a data standpoint?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know, Steve, do you want to go, or would you like me to take it? I'm trying to avoid the background noise I have, and I'm really sorry. So we would essentially assign each participant like a random alphanumeric code, right, that would be used to identify as their identifier and on the surveys and the biological samples, so that in that way there would not be any identifying information, no personally identifying information like names or any other information. And again, that would be required by law and by regulations before we could carry out this type of research study.
I should add that while we will collect consents and develop relationships as the researchers, nobody will know who is participating in this study outside of the researchers involved unless the volunteer themselves tells other people.
Well, and the community facilitators, right? If there's counselors involved,
Right. Anyone
the
who's involved,
nonprofit.
right? Anyone who's involved specifically in the project would know, but like the general public is what I mean. So thank you for that clarification. Like nobody outside of the people directly involved in the project would know unless the person, who is the volunteer told their friends and family or whatever, because we would not just tell the general public.
Yeah, that's another great point. Okay, I really want to say thank you to everybody who's given feedback so far, because these are exactly the kinds of things we've been seeking with this session. Before we go on to our last slide, are there any other questions that we can answer?
Go ahead.
I'm like also gauging like back to the mental health component, like lifestyle like factors. Like I feel like when people get more money, they spend less. So kind of like seeing if you can see if people are like maybe spending less on alcohol or going out on shopping and retail to try to fill that void.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Tania. That's great. That's a great point. And with I think it was the item number 1 where we said we would recommend getting surveys about spending decisions. That is exactly the kind of thing that we were talking about. Exactly.
While Tania was on the mic, I wanted to sort of reach out again. Do you have a sense of how long a survey could be in terms of time to complete to be a reasonable survey, and what type of compensation someone should be getting to fill out a survey of that length? I still want to push that we'd love to hear from participants their views on the length of survey and the appropriate compensation for completing the survey. And
biological measures. I just want to know the side of those.
Yes, okay.
I have opened up so everybody who's present can speak. I did the permissions to talk if anybody wants to chime in at this point.
Great, thanks, Gina.
Tania was about to talk. I think she started. Tania?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my pronouns are they, them. I think for when we pay people at our org, I think we try to do like a 50 to 100 an hour. So, half of that for a half hour. And then that survey depends on if people are like reading them themselves or being read to and answering.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful.
So we're on the last slide.
Okay. So there's a few final things, and these are sort of, I guess, more general, rather than recommendations we have drafted so far. These are things that we are seeking extra input on so that we can draft recommendations. The first is, what sort of supports, if you were in the study, what sort of supports would you want? For example, would you want counseling on the benefits, wraparound services, or other types of supports? Second is, what kinds of incentives would make it worthwhile to compare for the comparison group, so participants in the non-UBI group, to respond to surveys and provide samples? So that's exactly the question that Steve just put forth about gift cards, compensation. The third kind of thing is, would community members be interested in helping with data analysis for this project, for this research study, and in designing reports that would go out to the public? So it's a great opportunity to participate in citizen science. And how would you like to share? How would you recommend that information from this project be shared? And the fourth thing is, what concerns or worries do you have about this project that we can try to address while we're still planning before we submit our final recommendations? And that is with the caveat, of course, that we are working within certain kinds of constraints that we can't control, and we can only make recommendations. But given that, we will absolutely take every comment and feedback to Hart, and work to implement that in our recommendations to the City Council.
I've also put email addresses in the chat if you have recommendations you'd like to send us later.
And I'll put mine in as well. I can speak very specifically to the biological measures, but any of us can really answer or get answers from others on any types of questions.
I'm going to stop the share just because it's a little more social.
Yeah.
Everybody's face up there. Now the presentation is done.
Gina, I'm wondering if you could also just share the call-in line one last time for potential viewers who are not able to access the chat or.
Yes. Yes, thank you. The phone number is 646-558-8656. You know what? I am going to write this down and put it up on my screen.
Ah, smart. Thank you.
Yes, services.
All right. Please tell me if you can't read this. So, folks, please call in. If you are not
want to
on
hear
Zoom.
from you.
Yes, we want to hear from you. 646. Oh, I can't read it backwards. 646-558-8656. Webinar ID 849-9455-3500.
Are there any final comments or items for feedback that we can work into our recommendations from anyone out there?
Yeah, I would like to add that, you know, a lot of times people in communities are not given an opportunity to raise their concerns or have their thoughts and ideas included in these kinds of projects. And that's exactly why we're doing this forum today, to ensure that feedback. And for those people who do wind up participating, if it's approved by the City Council, it's also an opportunity to, you know, bust myths about the folks who are living in the city of Hartford, and people who are receiving, you know, some sort of UBI, right? There are a lot of people out there who just like to think the worst and assume that people can't make good decisions, or that they're gonna, like, that everyone who receives money is a horrible person or something, right? And so this is really a way to shine a light on the struggles that people have, and really look at how people's lives can be changed for the better. Oh, I see here from an anonymous attendee, this program can have the potential to change someone's life for the better. I thank you all for heading the task force. As a community member, I'm more than excited to share this possibility to the families that we serve once approved. Yeah, I feel the same way.
So should we be basically, I think we should probably adjourn the meeting in the next few minutes, unless anyone in the community has anything else they'd like to offer. We should probably wait a couple minutes before adjourning the meeting.
I'm gonna call someone to confirm if we can do that.
Also, I do just want to say I did log into the Facebook event page, and I didn't see any comments there, but I'm going to refresh and check again.
I just want to observe that we presented a lot of information in the PowerPoint presentation. And, you know, again, our emails are there if anybody wants to circle back with us and have a follow-up question. But also just to acknowledge that we certainly didn't address or cover everything that folks may be thinking about or concerned about. And even if it's not on that presentation, we certainly welcome those questions and comments and suggestions. So please don't feel like anything is out of bounds. We don't know what we don't know, which is exactly why we're coming to you. And so really, we're very, very open to your comments and suggestions as well as questions.
And I have received, oh, sorry, sorry about the typo there, Amanda.
No worries.
And I'd just like to say that we do have the go-ahead to end this early if there are no other comments or questions.
Sorry, that would have been good for everyone, but I just wanted to name again. I will reach out via email because I know I'm familiar with like some of the work that Hispanic Health Council does, just for those suggestions of like, you know, more facilitators and people from the community, because this conversation really intersects with the work that we're doing with like, you know, Health Equity Solutions and Institute for Community Research, when we're having this conversation about like progress, mental health and health and what it looks like. So really appreciate it, guys.
Please do tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We look forward to hearing from you and anyone else as well.
I'm not sure if Yesenia, she's showing up as asked to unmute. Did Yesenia want to say anything before we left? No, it doesn't look like it. Okay.
I'm seeing talking permitted for everyone. So.
Yeah,
Okay.
I set
So-
everyone to talking permitted.
Great.
And Tanaya, you know, your comments really speak to the kind of partnership that
Yeah.
we're seeking.
Exactly.
Thanks, y'all.
Goodbye, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Okay.